So this is the third time we've done this panel, and I keep trying to get out of the spot I'm in that I don't have to follow Brandon. My name is Nick Zingale. I'm with Cleveland State University, temporarily assigned to Case Western Reserve University. I'm not a neuroscientist. The most I know about the brain is that it's this kind of spiral thing that sits up in my head. I'm a phenomenologist by training who does work in government and policy-related issues. As a phenomenologist, what I'm interested in is the human experience and what that human experience means, particularly when it involves objects. Most phenomenology is focused on objects that are near and the way in which we use those objects, sometimes in a very intentional way and sometimes in a very subconscious way or in an absorbed coping way. This work being done with the prosthetic work and these mechanisms are of interest to me because they take something that could potentially be far away and make it near. And when you take something that is at a distance and make it near, you change the perceptions of that situation. And you also shape the context of what can happen and how we perceive ourselves within that situation. So we look at the different experiences that you've just seen through the first part of this panel. The first two speakers talk about the experience of the prosthetic, certainly through the lens and the perceptions of science and technology. And they answer the question about what can be there in the future for innovation with regard to science and technology. I think most of us are moved by Brandon's talk because there's a humanistic portion of it there and the humanistic potential there. There is a deeper meaning. It touches us in a different place about what those possibilities could be for the future of humanity. Same story, two different ways of looking at that story based on two different types of experiences. And as we go through the panel, you'll see there's a vastly more experiences that are there. So this is what I study. I study these types of experience that are in place. Part of the role at Human Fusion is to not just think in terms of the arm, but to think beyond the arm. And what do I mean by beyond the arm? Well, I'm not thinking just about the technology of what's available beyond the arm, but the opportunity that's presented when we begin to think of transcending the realities that we tend to confine ourselves with. In Brandon's case, he may have never been thinking about what those possibilities would have been had he not experienced limb loss and moved through what he had to move through. In our particular cases, when we begin to look at the possibilities of what this technology affords us, it affords us the opportunity to potentially send ourselves in multiple areas simultaneously, being able to experience things in other worlds, and actually having a sense of touch and feel in other places. So we often can do this through our imagination, right? We do this quite often when we sit still and we can imagine things in a different way. Einstein, of course, was famously known for dealing with his theory of relativity by imagining himself riding on a beam of light, right? Separating themselves from what's going on, but going through a thought experiment in which you embed yourself into some kind of an experience. Well, imagine if you were able to be anywhere at just about any time, experiencing just about anything. And in fact, what if you were able to do that in such a way in which you could be anything? Think of the possibilities that opens, the choices that opens for you, and the access that opens up for you to begin to learn different things. But I think most of us in the room would also sense that there are some challenges with this as well, and some things that we have to start thinking about today about what this technology affords us for tomorrow. The prospect of these kinds of technological augmented experiences, particularly when we pair these things with artificial intelligence and deep learning types of machines, means that we are going to be wrestling with some pretty difficult questions about a future that to some extent and to a large extent is unknowable. We have some idea of where it might be heading, but the issue is that we have to start wrestling with these larger questions today. So it might help for us to begin to think about what it means to be anywhere, anytime, doing anything by contextualizing it in something that's more explicit. For example, what might the future of work look like if we can go in and automaton into work, if we can use some kind of avatar to do the work? What might education and learning look like if we could use experiential learning in using our full senses in the teaching environment? What might medicine look like if we can look at the body from the inside out and do that consistently? And what might things like politics and policy look like if we can begin to have people who are making the rules actually go out and experience what it's like to feel about being homeless or not having direct access to food? How might that shape policymaking into the future? These are big questions. And we're not going to be able to explicitly answer any of these questions today, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't start talking about these questions. Most would agree that when we start to think about these questions, every one of those little question marks up there could be different disciplines and many, many more different perspectives of how to look at something. So it raises this issue is how do we begin to think about transcending what we bring into the conversation to something that's larger and more broader, something that brings in multiple perspectives from multiple people, from multiple cultural dynamics and different experiences. It's a tough thing to do. We think about human fusions and what we're doing here. We are not just talking about physical symbiosis of humans and technology. We are also talking about experiential symbiosis of humans and their perspectives. And as Dustin said, this is a tough part of what it is that we're doing. It's something for those of you who caught Fifi Lee's talk yesterday morning from the Stanford Human-Centered AI Lab, raised this particular question. Max Tegmark and at MIT and Elon Musk and a few others through the Future of Life Institute are wrestling with this very same thing as well. How do we begin to think about a future in which we have these opportunities of engaging one another in ways that we never have had before, and therefore raising the level of what we can potentially understand and what this may ultimately mean to us? And ultimately, how do we bring in these perspectives, these multiple perspectives? This is a little bit of a busy diagram, but I actually use this diagram when I talk about facial recognition software and what's being used. And when I talk to city officials about facial recognition software and deploying facial recognition, that's the diagram I show them. If you want to do facial recognition software, those are all the things you have to be worrying about to make it happen within a city, and maybe more. You've got the insert circles and all the overlaps, and every one of those points are overlapping point that bring in uncertainty and bring in potential conflict. What resides in the middle of this diagram is something that Nicolas Shea brought up, Basrad brought up, called the hidden third. And what I've drawn into there is kind of this infinity symbol. I think about that infinity symbol in a way in which we can think about how we contextualize an environment, conceptualize what it is that we're doing, and then do something that's called contextualize, which isn't a real word. But this idea of contextualize is how do we begin to make something present and real beyond the talk of what it is that we're doing? Okay. What we found at the Human Fusions Institute is that we have to actually engage with one another within the labs, within the people who are experiencing this, and we have to be present in that particular type of an activity. It isn't good enough for us to just talk and be separated from what it is that's going on. We have to be intimately involved with one another, thinking alongside one another, and doing the best that we can to try and understand the languages that separate us and the experiences that separate us. It's a really, really messy process. But it's a process that's worthwhile because it leads to the types of things that we've been able to do with human fusions and the way that we've been thinking about the possibility of what's there. The idea is that hopefully by doing this, we can see things better, we can hear things better, we can understand things better, and that will lead to a more expansive understanding of what it is that we're working towards. There are all sorts of problems that are associated with doing this. But there's three that we keep bumping into routinely with these types of transdisciplinary types of approaches. Structure and power, frameworks of inquiry, and something that I'm referring to as unreconcilable differences in the way that we view the world. So structure and power. Place matters, structure matters. These things are extremely important. What we have to do is be very, very intentional about allowing people to have a voice that don't tend to have a voice, or maybe too timid to raise their voice. So I challenge all of you at the end of this, when we get into the roundtable, is ask us questions. Don't be afraid to speak your mind, even if your voice shakes on what it is that we're trying to work on. It can only make what we're doing better. Jose Rizal's Triumph of Science Over Death, this particular statue stands outside of the University of the Philippines College of Medicine. It represents something of science, but the root of this is called scientia. In fact, this statue is oftentimes referred to as scientia. But the scientia is different than what we traditionally in Western culture view of science. Scientia takes into account, particularly the Latin root, or if you look at the German word for this, Wissenschaft, these are more expansive ways of understanding what science means and what we do with science. So by intention within Human Fusions, we try to expand what it is that we mean by science to include the non-sciences that are involved. And we don't set these things up as hierarchical kind of formations where the scientists are telling the non-scientists what it's all about, right? It's about, again, that power dynamic and leveling that playing field and allowing the opportunities for people to have voice where they tend to not have voice. And then being willing to go visiting in other areas. You know, Hannah Arendt, a little side note there, Hannah Arendt was a German phenomenologist. And she wrote a paper about going visiting, and what she tried to argue with that paper is that if we want to understand something from somebody else's perspective, we have to be very intentional about going visiting. She followed that thought up with something she did some years later that says, to be able to make going visiting possible, we have to be very intentional about our friendships, and we have to actually work to direct friendships and don't just let them come naturally, because across our disciplines, it's hard to make those friendships and keep them working. Some of you may have seen this book, The Physicist and the Philosopher. If not, I encourage you to pick up the book and read the book. It goes back to the debate of time that happened in 1922 between Henri Bergson and Albert Einstein, two different views of time. Albert Einstein's objective look of clock time using the speed of light, and Henri Bergson's view of lifetime or life experiences as we begin to view time. What the book points out, and becomes extremely prevalent to today, is that we tend to approach what it is that we do within our work through different frameworks of inquiry. And those frameworks of inquiry can serve to separate us unless we're really intentional about understanding how other people approach their own research. All research doesn't happen to follow the traditional scientific method. It doesn't mean that it's non-scientific. It just means that it's a different framework of inquiry that sheds light on what it is that we see and what it is that we do. So with this, I'll close in saying that at Human Fusions Institute, we're trying to work across these transdisciplinary approaches to think not only about, but beyond the arm. This requires effort to democratize our experiences across, between, and beyond the human tech world to include the human experiential world. Our hope is that it will help us gain a better grip on the fundamental principles that ought to shape our technological aspirations and endeavor us to think more broadly about what human fusions can mean for humanity and the future of life. Thank you.